With a franchise that changes as much as the Sonic the Hedgehog franchise, there's bound to be some disagreements. One of the most divisive pieces of media to come out in the Sonic franchise as of recent was Sonic Prime. There's a lot of reason why fans had issues with this show. The biggest crime that Sonic Prime, hey, that rhymes, commits is that the show is canon to the main series. And it's not just canon to the main series in the sense of like Sonic X, where there's, you know, some loose adaptation of events that take place in the games. You know, like for example, how they did a Sonic Adventure 2 arc, a Sonic Battle arc, a Sonic Adventure 1 arc. When the show writers came out and said that the show is actually canon to the main Sonic the Hedgehog timeline, like this is the same Sonic from the video games, that is when the fans voiced their frustrations. It's not that the games are canon to Prime, it's that Prime is canon to the games, if that makes sense. For example, if Sonic Frontiers takes place after Sonic Prime, that would presume that the same Sonic from Sonic Frontiers experienced the events of Sonic Prime. I know it can be confusing, but it's really not. The biggest issue that people had with the fact that Prime was canon to the games was there was tons of inconsistencies with the Sonic lore, and a lot of people did not really care for Sonic's particular characterization in this series. New revelations, yes, 5 months after Sonic Prime ended, are giving us some insight as to why some of these inconsistencies occurred, and the status of Sonic Prime being in the canon altogether, with some additional insight that is making fans pretty upset. So let's go ahead and get into that. But first, make sure to subscribe to the channel with all notifications. I'll give you a second. And let's get into it. So let's give you guys some context as to why this matters in the first place. Sorry to bring this up again for frequent viewers of the channel, but if you're new here, I'm gonna have to tap the sign again. So the reason why this matters is because Sega hired a Sonic lore manager to ensure the universe is more meaningfully connected across games, animations, comics, and more. Essentially, what this Sonic lore team is trying to do is really tie up the canon and try to make sure all of Sonic media is basically interconnected. Because of stuff like this, Sonic IDW is actually canon to the mainline games. You'll notice a ton of references in games like Sonic Frontiers to previous Sonic adventures to kind of like tie everything in and make sure that the story is kind of cohesive and connected. And you also see this philosophy in Sonic Prime where Sega says that this show is canon to the mainline game universe. But again, when you try to make everything connect, sometimes you open yourself up for scrutiny, and man, there is a ton of scrutiny amongst the Sonic fan base. When you look at Sonic Prime, you wonder, why is Rouge hanging out with the main cast? Some fans will say, why does Knuckles live in Green Hill? Although I don't know if there's evidence that he actually lives in Green Hill in the show, but you guys get the gist. They might point out things like, why does Sonic say he's never seen robots without flickies, although he has seen them before? In games like Sonic Heroes, which definitely takes place before Sonic Prime, and the existence of characters like Shadow the Hedgehog definitely prove this. Another thing that people like to highlight when they talk about inconsistencies of the show is, why does Sonic act like he's never seen a robotic version of himself when he sees Chaos Sonic for the first time? Assuming that Prime is canon to the game, Sonic has obviously dealt with Metal Sonic several times in the past. So now we bring in Ian Flynn, who is the current writer for the Sonic games and the IDW comics, and you'll notice that he was hired as a consultant for Sonic Prime. Being that Ian actually works on the Sonic lore team and he was hired as a consultant for Sonic Prime, a lot of people like to scapegoat him and blame him for some of the inconsistencies of the show. So he was asked about some of these inconsistencies recently on his podcast, and what he had to say had the Sonic fans pretty mad, and it's actually pretty shocking to hear this. So why don't we roll the clip and then we'll discuss all the news and get into the reaction.
Will we ever have an answer to the many Prime contradictions? In episode 1, Sonic mentions that Badniks with not flickies is new, even though Heroes and many other games show us that's not the case. Unless this takes place prior to Heroes, which I'm wondering how is Shadow just roaming around. This makes no sense. I'm looking too hard on this, am I? You did say you will reveal when it takes place and the show's done anyway, so I fear nothing. I have nothing to suspect, right?
It's one of those things where it'll have to be slotted somewhere, and I made great pains to flag a lot of stuff early on, and a number of other parties did what they could to flag inconsistencies, and some of it was just flat out ignored. So there's a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of stuff that kind of just gets lost in the shuffle, especially on a television schedule. So I don't think there will be one singular perfect way to brush aside the lack of consistency with Sonic Prime, but it wasn't for lack of effort. I'll tell you that much. And it kills me because the voice cast did such a fantastic job, and the art team really did, I think, a stellar job for a CG cartoon on that tight of a schedule. It is a good looking, good sounding show.
Well, it wasn't originally meant or conceived to be part of the mainline Sonic canon originally. That mandate didn't come down until later. So
I am under the it's my understanding that was always in the background, and that's kind of why I was brought on early as a consultant.
Okay.
But, a consultant's position really is you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink it.
I suppose.
So essentially here, the shocking revelation is that Man of Action and Wildbrain Studios basically ignored Ian Flynn as a consultant for the show. He tried to flag some of the inconsistencies, but it seems like some of that was ignored. And now that the show is like shoehorned into the canon, you can see why the fans are upset, because things don't really add up perfectly. I do think that the details are kind of minor and there's ways for them to explain around it potentially, but here's what the fans are saying. This person says, "You mean to tell me that the Sonic Prime writers deliberately ignored lore contradictions despite Ian being brought in as a consultant, and Sega mandated it as part of the mainline canon?" So that is now 2 recent Sonic products where lore team made a lot of notes that are completely being ignored by other parties. I'm starting to think that my theory about the lore team is only established to throw tomatoes at them instead of Sega is becoming true. I guess they referred to Sonic Superstars because Ian Flynn talked about how Trip has a super form, but the other characters don't. That's a different subject for a different video. Is that the reason why Sonic is written like an idiot in Sonic Prime? My god, they did him dirty. I'm genuinely in shock that this entire show is practically one big Sonic fanfic that non-Sonic fans wrote. They flat out ignored notes on the lore and inconsistencies on purpose. Messed up. If Sonic Prime's goal is to fit within the canon, I think that's on them if they didn't, but I do think making everything canon was a mistake to begin with. Canon isn't synonymous with quality / meaningfulness. Some of my favorite media is my favorite because it's its own thing. For all the people that blame Ian Flynn for this, I think you owe him a big apology. This explains so much, and people blamed Ian Flynn for the show being canon and whatnot, if I remember correctly, but bro tried to fix it the whole time. This show literally doomed itself, and people still wanted to blame him for the show being a mess. I think the writers at Wildbrain underestimated how much this would piss off the fan base. So yeah, people are not happy with the fact that the lore team was ignored for a lot of the inconsistencies, which makes people wonder why they even exist in the first place. It's not all bad and doom and gloom with the show though. For what it's worth, Sonic Prime did kind of set out for what it had to do. It actually reached number 5 on Netflix most watched list within a week. In the first half of 2023, viewers watched the show for 82.1 million hours. We got one of the best Shadow the Hedgehogs we've seen in a very long time in the franchise. Somehow, I have no idea how they were able to pull that off. 9 was also a really good character. I genuinely enjoyed his arc. The biggest problem with the show is the ending was really bad. And obviously, it wasn't the best characterization for Sonic. I think a lot of people can definitely concede that the show definitely had a lot of missed opportunity, especially when you listen to the plot synopsis of the show. It's like Sonic is going on this journey of self-discovery because he made mistakes and he has to go back into like alternate timelines and stuff like that. You're thinking, you know, maybe it'll be like some Into the Sonic verse kind of thing, or at the very least the show would have like a little bit more of a mature and darker tone, something like we've seen in the past with Sonic X. And obviously that wasn't the case, but it feels like because this was supposed to be Game Sonic, it could have been a little bit more than it actually was. Another big issue that is still yet to be addressed with the show, so I'm sure we will revisit this topic, or maybe we'll make a separate video talking about this, but we still don't know when the show takes place in the timeline. Since the show is now canon to the mainline games, we do have to figure out exactly when this takes place. And for those of you who missed my video about this a couple months ago, according to Ian Flynn, this is all we know about Sonic Prime's place in the timeline. He says, "Howdy folks, all I've said is that I don't want to talk about Prime's placement until it was done. If you've seen that ending, then spoilers. It doesn't matter because Prime wipes itself out. It's sometime after Advance 3, but otherwise it's moot." So Sonic Prime actually does wipe itself out of the timeline. So for all this fuss about if Sonic Prime is canon or not, technically it is wiped out. All the events were erased from the timeline. Some people may even point out this: why make the show canon if it's going to wipe itself out in the first place and they're going to ignore the lore team? Doesn't really matter though, because we still need an answer. Like, I mean, it took place at some point, you know, so we have to figure out when that is. The existence of Orbot and Cubot could suggest that it takes place either right before or after Sonic Colors. The Sonic Advance 3 flashback also proves that, of course, like Ian Flynn said, it's after Sonic Advance 3. Also, the presence of Shadow the Hedgehog and the way he acts in the show also probably means that the show takes place after Shadow 05 and Sonic 06. As far as what's definitive, that's all we got, and the way Sonic's characterized to me feels like it was sometime in the meta era, but who knows? This is a position many people might have. Perhaps it's better off just leaving a lot of this stuff ambiguous and maybe not trying to shoehorn everything into the canon and trying to over-explain everything, because then you create issues like this within the fan base. Let me know what you guys think about all this crazy news. Let me know if you like Sonic Prime, and let me know if this changes your opinion about anything regarding the show. If you like Sonic lore and theory videos, make sure to watch my Shadow the Hedgehog character analysis video in the top right corner.